Marcus's voice trembled as two uniformed officers escorted him down the narrow aisle. Passengers whispered phones recording as if a criminal had just been caught mid-air. His crime scribbling calculus formulas about robotics in a notebook. Behind the cockpit door, the captain refused to meet his eyes. But what none of them knew was that Marcus's father, Winston Johnson, the airline's own chairman, was about to receive a single text that would stop every plane under his command. The engines roared, but soon the entire sky would go silent. The world seemed to slow down as Marcus stood, his 6'2" frame suddenly feeling too large, too visible in the cramped economy section of Trans-American Airlines flight 2267 from Chicago to San Francisco. As he reached for his backpack in the overhead bin, he caught fragmented whispers. Saw him looking at something on his phone, muttering to himself, "Better safe than sorry these days." 15 minutes earlier, he'd been texting his father about his college visit, excited to share his impressions of Stanford's engineering program. Now surrounded by stares that ranged from curious to openly hostile, Marcus felt his careful dignity crumbling. What no one on Flight 2267 knew was that exactly 43 minutes later, in the executive offices of Transamerica's headquarters, Winston Johnson would be staring in disbelief at an urgent text from his son. The same Winston Johnson whose signature appeared on every pilot's paycheck. The same Winston Johnson who, as chairman of Trans-American Airlines, had the power to ground every aircraft in their fleet with a single command. And by sundown, that's exactly what he would do. 6 hours earlier, Marcus Johnson stood in the kitchen of their Lakeshore Drive penthouse, his Stanford University hoodie still new enough that the fabric retained its stiffness. His father, Winston, studied the Chicago Tribune while nursing his second cup of coffee, the morning light illuminating the silver at his temples. "You've got everything right. Boarding pass ID, the admissions packet," Winston asked without looking up from his paper. "Dad, we've been through the checklist 3 times, Marcus replied, trying to mask his nervousness with teenage confidence. "I've got this." Winston finally looked up, his expression softening. "I know you do. It's just your first solo flight, your first college visit without me or your mother. It's a big step, which is exactly why I need to do it alone." Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "Mom would be telling me I'm ready." The mention of Diane, gone 2 years now to breast cancer, hung in the air between them. Winston nodded, folding the newspaper with precision. "She'd be incredibly proud of you," he said finally. "Stanford was her dream for you since you built that robot in 3rd grade. Marcus smiled, the memory warming him. The one that caught fire and set off the sprinklers. The very one she saw the engineer in you even then. Winston stood and straightened his Italian suit jacket. The picture of corporate success. "I've got meetings until 6, but text me when you land. The company driver will take you to the airport." His mind drifted momentarily to the first time Deanne had brought 5-year-old Marcus to the Trans-American headquarters. The boy had been wide-eyed with wonder at the model airplanes and global maps that decorated the executive floor. While Winston had been busy with calls, Diane had taken Marcus to the operations center, where flight paths crisscrossed across massive digital displays. The operations director still talked about how the kindergartner had asked surprisingly insightful questions about fuel efficiency and route optimization. "I know, Dad. I've got the TransAim VIP treatment all arranged." Marcus replied, his voice taking on a teasing tone. "Though I'm still flying economy like a regular person, you know, character building." Winston laughed. "That was your choice, not mine. I offered business class and have the Stanford tour group think I'm some entitled rich kid. No thanks." Winston's expression turned serious. "Marcus, you've never been entitled a day in your life. Your mother and I made sure of that." It was true. Despite their wealth and Winston's position, Diane had been adamant that Marcus understood privilege and responsibility. She'd instituted mandatory volunteer work from the time he was 10. Food banks, literacy programs, and the robotics workshop she'd helped fund in an underserved Chicago neighborhood. That last one had evolved from obligation to passion, with Marcus spending every Saturday for the past 5 years teaching coding and engineering principles to middle schoolers. The doorbell interrupted their moment. "That's my ride," Marcus said, hoisting his backpack. "I'll make you both proud, Dad." Winston pulled his son into a hug, holding a moment longer than usual. "You already do every day." As Marcus rode the elevator down from the penthouse, his phone buzzed with a text from his best friend Devon. "Devon, don't forget to take pics of all the California girls, person female." Marcus smiled, typing back quickly. "Marcus, it's a college visit, not spring break." Devon, "Same difference. Bet you'll come back with a surfboard and a girlfriend." Marcus laughed, tucking his phone away as the elevator doors opened to the lobby. The doorman nodded respectfully. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. Your car is waiting." "Thanks, Eddie," Marcus replied, suddenly feeling very grown up. His father was right. This was a milestone. First solo flight, first college visit on his own. First real step toward the future he'd been working toward his whole life. He recalled his mother's words from his 16th birthday, just months before her diagnosis. "The most important decisions in life are the ones you make independently. Trust your judgment, Marcus. It's solid." The company driver, a middle-aged man named Carlos, who'd been with Transamerican for over 15 years, greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Marcus. Your father mentioned this is a big day for you." "Yeah, visiting Stanford, my mom's alma mater." Carlos nodded, pulling smoothly into the morning Chicago traffic. "She was a wonderful lady. Your mother always remembered my kids' names, asked about them every time." Marcus settled into the plush leather seat, the familiar scent of the company car bringing back memories of airport runs with his parents. His mother always prepared with snacks and activities. His father making last-minute business calls. Those trips had tapered off as he'd grown older, and his parents' careers had intensified. But for a moment, he could almost feel Diane's presence beside him, her voice gentle as she pointed out Chicago landmarks they passed. "My oldest just started college too," Carlos continued, interrupting Marcus's thoughts. "University of Illinois, first one in our family to go. Your mother helped with some scholarship recommendations." Marcus hadn't known that. "Really, that's awesome. What's he studying?" "Aerospace engineering." Carlos said, pride evident in his voice. "He wants to design aircraft. Growing up hearing my stories about TransAim inspired him. Maybe he'll work for my dad someday," Marcus said. Carlos glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Maybe you both will, following in your parents' footsteps." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure the airline business is for me. I'm more interested in robotics, AI, that kind of thing. Your own path." Carlos nodded approvingly. "Your mother would appreciate that." The drive to O'Hare passed quickly with Carlos sharing stories about Diane Johnson that Marcus hadn't heard before. How she'd organized a Christmas toy drive for employees' children. How she'd personally visited Carlos's wife in the hospital after a surgery. "Your mom was the heart of TransAim long before your dad became chairman," Carlos said as they pulled up to the terminal. "She made it feel like family." Marcus nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "Thanks, Carlos. I needed that today." "You've got a lot of her in you," Carlos replied, helping with Marcus's bag. "Have a good flight, Mr. Johnson." "Just Marcus, please." Carlos smiled knowingly. "Of course, Marcus. Safe travels." Inside the terminal, Marcus navigated security with the ease of someone who'd been traveling his whole life, though always with his parents before. The TSA agent barely glanced at his ID, waving him through with mechanical efficiency. At 17, Marcus was already accustomed to the way some adults looked past him, around him, or through him. His mother had prepared him for this reality with frank discussions that his father had found difficult to initiate. Being tall and black means you'll be simultaneously hyper-visible and invisible, she'd explained during one of their late-night talks after a store security guard had followed 14-year-old Marcus through a shopping mall. Hyper-visible as a potential threat, invisible as a complete human being. It's not fair, but awareness is your first defense. He stopped to grab breakfast at a terminal cafe, watching the morning hustle of O'Hare with interest. Business people with rolling briefcases, families corralling excited children, stressed solo travelers checking watches and departure boards. A symphony of humanity, his mother would have called it. The cashier did a slight double take when he presented his credit card. The same reaction he often got when people connected his name with the airline. He'd grown used to it, though he never volunteered the information about his father's position. Diane had raised him to judge people by how they treated you when they thought you were nobody special. As he waited for his breakfast sandwich, an older woman in her 70s struggled with her rolling suitcase nearby, trying to manage it along with her handbag and a cup of coffee. The suitcase tipped and the coffee slushed dangerously. Without hesitation, Marcus stepped forward. "Ma'am, can I help you with that?" She looked up, surprised but grateful. "Oh, thank you, young man. These old hands aren't what they used to be." Marcus steadied her coffee cup and took the handle of her suitcase. "Where are you headed? Gate C42, San Francisco. Visiting my new grandbaby," she said, her face lighting up. "That's my flight too," Marcus said, smiling. "I'll walk with you if you'd like." The woman studied him for a moment, her initial surprise giving way to a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Marcus was familiar with this transition, the momentary hesitation followed by acceptance once he spoke. His father called it the ambassador burden, carrying himself in a way that put others at ease. His mother had called it simply navigating. As they made their way to the gate, she introduced herself as Dorothy Whitman, a retired school teacher from Chicago's South Side. "What takes you to San Francisco, young man?" she asked. "College visit Stanford." Dorothy's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "Stanford? My, that's impressive. What do you want to study engineering specifically, robotics and AI?" Marcus replied, warming to the subject. "I'm working on a project now that uses artificial intelligence to help mobility-impaired people navigate their homes more easily." "Fascinating. In my day, we thought calculators were high technology." Dorothy laughed. "You know, I taught mathematics for 40 years. Always tried to encourage my girls, especially, to pursue science and math. Not enough young women in those fields when I was teaching." Marcus thought about his mother, who'd been one of only 7 women in her engineering class at Stanford in the early 1990s. "My mom used to say the same thing. She ran a girls' coding camp every summer." "A smart woman, your mother," Dorothy said approvingly. "She was," Marcus agreed. The past tense still painful after 2 years. "The smartest person I've ever known." Dorothy caught the shift in his voice. "I'm sorry to hear that, dear." "Cancer 2 years ago." The words came out clipped, practiced. Marcus had learned that brevity helped him maintain composure when discussing Diane's death. Dorothy placed a gentle hand on his arm. "That's very hard, especially at your age. I lost my husband 5 years ago. It changes you, that kind of loss." They continued chatting as they arrived at the gate where Dorothy insisted Marcus sit beside her. "You've restored my faith in the younger generation," she told him with a wink. "Most teenagers I see can't look up from their phones long enough to notice an old lady struggling." "My mom would have my hide if I walked past someone who needed help," Marcus said with a grin. Their conversation deepened as they waited, moving from pleasantries to Dorothy's 40-year teaching career in Chicago's public schools, her observations on how education and students had changed, and her concerns about technology's impact on learning. Marcus found himself engaged by her perspectives, which balanced skepticism of new trends with an underlying optimism about young people. "You remind me of my best students," she told him, "the ones who asked why instead of just how." Their conversation was interrupted by the gate agent announcing pre-boarding for passengers needing assistance. Dorothy gathered her things. "That's me with these arthritic knees," she said. "Thank you again for your help, Marcus. Good luck at Stanford, though. Something tells me you make your own luck." As Dorothy made her way to the gate, Marcus settled in to wait for his boarding group. He pulled out his phone to text his father. Marcus at the gate. Everything going smoothly. Met a nice retired teacher, headed to SF to meet her new grandchild. Winston's reply came quickly. "Winston, making friends already. Have a good flight. Remember to text me when you land." The boarding process began smoothly with Marcus in Group 3. As he made his way down the jetway, he felt a flutter of independence. His first solo flight. Another small step into adulthood. On board, he found his window seat in row 17 and settled in, placing his backpack under the seat in front of him. He noticed Dorothy, several rows ahead, already engaged in conversation with her seatmate. The middle seat next to Marcus remained empty as boarding continued, but eventually a businessman in his 40s claimed it, nodding a brief greeting before immersing himself in his laptop. The man reminded Marcus of his father's colleagues, perpetually preoccupied existing in a parallel world of spreadsheets and quarterly projections. Winston had been like that once before Diane's illness had forced a re-evaluation of priorities. Her 14-month battle had transformed him, chipping away at the corporate armor to reveal the more vulnerable man beneath. Just before the doors closed, a middle-aged couple hurried aboard, slightly flustered. The woman, blonde with an expensive-looking haircut and designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, scanned the row numbers with obvious annoyance. Richard were back here 17A, and B. Marcus realized with a sinking feeling that he was in 17A. As they approached, he quickly checked his boarding pass. Sure enough, he was in 17C, the aisle seat. He'd sat in the wrong place. "Excuse me," he said as they reached the row. "I think I'm in your seat. I'm supposed to be in 17C. The woman, whom Marcus would later learn was Sharon Miller, looked at him with narrow-eyed suspicion. "Yes, you are." Her tone suggested this minor mix-up was a personal affront. "Sorry about that," Marcus said, gathering his things to move. The businessman in the middle seat sighed dramatically at having to stand again. Once everyone was settled in their correct seats, the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Marcus noticed Sharon Miller watching him from the corner of her eye, clutching her handbag closer to her body. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the view out the window as the plane pushed back from the gate. Sharon Miller's reaction wasn't unfamiliar. Marcus had experienced similar responses from strangers before. Women who clutched their purses tighter when he entered an elevator, security guards who followed him through stores, people who crossed the street when they saw him approaching on the sidewalk. His father had insisted these incidents weren't always about race, but his mother had been more direct. "People's reactions to you aren't your responsibility," she told him after a particularly hurtful incident when he was 15. "But how you respond to them is. You can let it make you bitter, or you can let it make you better." As they taxied, Marcus pulled out his phone to switch it to airplane mode. He opened his Stanford information packet one last time, reviewing the schedule for tomorrow's engineering department tour. Excitement bubbled up again as he looked at photos of the campus, imagining himself there. Stanford had been his dream school since he was 12, when his mother had taken him to visit her alma mater during a business trip to San Francisco. The campus had seemed magical to him then. The Spanish architecture, the palm trees, the sense of possibility that permeated the engineering buildings. Diane had walked him through the lab, where she'd spent most of her undergraduate years, pointing out how much had changed while explaining how her education there had shaped her thinking. "What are you looking at so intently?" The question came from Sharon Miller, her tone somewhere between curiosity and accusation. "Just my college visit information," Marcus replied politely. "I'm touring Stanford tomorrow." She responded, clearly unconvinced. Her husband Richard gave Marcus an apologetic half-smile before returning to his financial newspaper. Richard Miller, though Marcus couldn't know it yet, was a mid-level investment banker with a specialty in airline securities. He had in fact attended several trans-American investor calls and had once briefly met Winston Johnson at an industry conference. But in the confined space of row 17, these connections remained hidden, the subtle threads of connection invisible as the plane ascended into the clear morning sky. The flight took off smoothly, climbing above the Chicago skyline and banking west toward California. Once they reached cruising altitude, Marcus pulled out his notebook and began sketching refinements to his robotics project, occasionally muttering calculations to himself as he worked through a particularly challenging algorithm. The project had begun as a response to his mother's illness. During Diane's last months as mobility became increasingly difficult, Marcus had started developing a voice-activated home assistance system more sophisticated than commercial models. Though he hadn't completed it before she died, He'd continued the work, expanding its capabilities and potential applications. The notebook contained 2 years of iterations, failed attempts, and breakthrough moments. He was so engrossed that he barely noticed Sharon Miller shifting uncomfortably beside him, watching his notations with growing agitation. The complex mathematics and diagrams, clear to Marcus but resembling cryptic code, to the untrained eye filled page after page. He'd switch occasionally to his phone, pulling up technical specifications or research papers he'd saved, then back to the notebook to adjust his calculations. When the flight attendant came by with the beverage cart, Marcus put away his notebook and ordered a ginger ale. "And what can I get for you, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked Sharon. Instead of ordering, Sharon leaned forward and whispered something to the attendant, her eyes darting meaningfully toward Marcus. The flight attendant's professional smile faltered slightly as she listened, then nodded and continued down the aisle without serving the Millers. Marcus felt a prickle of unease, but dismissed it. Perhaps she was asking about a connection or a special meal request. He returned to his ginger ale and pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos of the Stanford engineering facilities that the admissions office had sent. The images transported him momentarily from the confines of the aircraft. He imagined walking the same paths his mother had walked, perhaps even having some of the same professors she'd had, though most would be retired by now. He'd saved one photo as his phone's background, the Gates Computer Science Building, where he hoped to spend most of his time if accepted. A few minutes later, the same flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by a male colleague. They paused at his row. "Sir, could you come with us for a moment?" The male flight attendant asked, his voice professional but tense. Confused, Marcus looked up. "Is something wrong? We just need to speak with you privately." The female attendant said, her smile strained, aware that passengers nearby were beginning to stare. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. As he followed the flight attendants toward the front of the plane, he glanced back to see Sharon Miller watching, with a satisfied expression, whispering to her husband. At the front galley, out of earshot of other passengers, the male flight attendant. His name tag read, Michael, spoke in a low, serious tone. "Sir, we've received concerns about your behavior from another passenger." Marcus blinked in surprise. "My behavior? What do you mean?" The female attendant, Jessica, according to her name tag, interjected. "A passenger reported that you've been acting suspiciously, writing in code, muttering to yourself, and looking at what appeared to be building schematics." Realization dawned on Marcus. "Those are my engineering notes and pictures of Stanford University. I'm visiting their engineering program tomorrow. I'm a high school student." Michael and Jessica exchanged glances. "May I see your ID, please?" Michael asked. Marcus reached for his wallet, producing his driver's license. "I'm 17. This is my first time flying alone. I don't understand what's happening." As he handed over his ID, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The same feeling he'd experienced when stopped by mall security, when followed by store employees, when questioned about whether he belonged in certain spaces. The cool plastic of his license seemed insufficient proof of his legitimacy, his right to exist unquestioned. Jessica examined his ID, then handed it back. "I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Johnson. Let me speak with the captain, and we'll get this sorted out." As she stepped away toward the cockpit, Michael remained with Marcus. "Just wait here a moment, please." Marcus felt his heart pounding. The situation was becoming increasingly surreal. Through the galley curtain, he could see passengers watching, whispering to each other. The humiliation burned hot on his cheeks. He thought of his father's advice for difficult situations. Back straight, voice calm, emotions controlled. Winston Johnson had navigated corporate America as one of very few black executives in the airline industry, and his lessons on managing others' perceptions had been specific and practical. But in this moment, all the careful preparation felt inadequate. Jessica returned a moment later, her expression grim. "Mr. Johnson, I'm afraid the captain has made the decision that you'll need to deplane before we continue to San Francisco." What Marcus felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. "You're removing me from the flight because I was working on an engineering project." "It's the captain's decision, sir," Michael said firmly. We'll have your checked baggage removed and customer service will help rebook you on a later flight. Marcus struggled to process what was happening. This is because of what that woman said. Did anyone even look at my notes or ask me what I was doing? Sir, please lower your voice, Jessica said, glancing nervously toward the passenger cabin. Security will escort you off the aircraft. We need to maintain the safety of all passengers. Security, Marcus repeated, incredulous. I'm a 17-year-old kid going to visit a college. How am I a security threat? But his protests fell on deaf ears. Jessica was already on the phone, presumably calling for security personnel. Michael stood guard, as if Marcus might attempt to rush back to his seat or storm the cockpit. Marcus felt a rush of complex emotions, humiliation, anger, confusion, and beneath it all, a profound sadness that threatened to overwhelm him. He thought of his mother, who had always been his fiercest advocate. What would Diane Johnson have done in this moment? The question steadied him somewhat. She would have been furious but strategic. She would have documented everything, collected names, maintained dignity, while yielding nothing. Pick your battles carefully, she'd always told him. But when you're right, don't back down. As the reality of the situation settled over him, Marcus felt a cold, heavy weight in his stomach. He was being removed from a flight because a paranoid woman had decided his engineering notes looked suspicious. Because a teenage black boy working on complex mathematics had been deemed threatening. Can I at least get my backpack? He asked, his voice hollow. Michael nodded. I'll retrieve it for you. What row were you in? 17, aisle seat. As Michael went to get his belongings, Marcus stood alone in the galley, the target of curious and suspicious stares from nearby passengers. He pulled out his phone hands, shaking slightly, and did the only thing he could think to do. He texted his father. Marcus, Dad, something crazy is happening. They're kicking me off the flight because someone thought my engineering notes looked suspicious. I didn't do anything wrong. The text showed as delivered, but there was no immediate response. Winston was likely in meetings, his phone silenced. Marcus felt very young and very alone. The sense of isolation intensified as he realized this might be precisely what his father had feared when suggesting business class, not for the comfort, but for the insulation from exactly this type of situation. His father, who had climbed to the pinnacle of an industry while carrying the extra weight of being the only one in the room, so often had tried to protect him in ways Marcus hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. Michael returned with his backpack, just as 2 airport security officers arrived at the aircraft door, which had been reopened. Dorothy Whitman, the elderly teacher he'd helped earlier, watched from her seat with obvious concern and confusion. This way, sir, one of the security officers said, gesturing toward the door. With as much dignity as he could muster, Marcus Johnson walked off Flight 2267, aware of the whispers and stares following him. As he stepped back into the terminal, he heard the distinctive voice of Sharon Miller behind him. Better safe than sorry these days, you just never know. Winston Johnson sat at the head of the conference table in TransAim's executive boardroom, half listening as the chief financial officer droned on about quarterly projections. 23 years in the airline industry, the last 5 as chairman, and Winston still found budget meetings insufferable. The rhythmic tapping of his Mont Blanc pen against his leather portfolio was the only outward sign of his impatience. Around him, 12 executives in nearly identical suits analyzed spreadsheets displaying profit margins measured in fractions of cents per passenger mile. Winston had once been energized by these details. Now they seemed increasingly arbitrary numbers divorced from the people they represented. His mind wandered to Marcus. By now, his son would be somewhere over the Midwest, probably sketching new robotics designs or chatting with his seatmate. Winston smiled slightly, remembering how Diane used to tease him about their son's social ease. He certainly didn't get that from your side of the family, Mr. Corporate Stiff. Diane had been the people person, the emotional intelligence to balance Winston's analytical precision. Their differences had made them stronger as a couple and as parents. Her absence these past 2 years had left Winston constantly second-guessing his parenting decisions, particularly as Marcus navigated the transition from child to young adult. The vibration of his phone in his pocket interrupted his thoughts. Winston never checked messages during board meetings. It set a poor example, but something compelled him to glance discreetly at the screen. Marcus, Dad, something crazy is happening. They're kicking me off the flight because someone thought my engineering notes looked suspicious. I didn't do anything wrong. Winston stared at the message, certain he'd misunderstood. Marcus removed from a flight. His flight, a trans-American flight. He read the message again, his pulse accelerating as the implications registered. Throughout his career, Winston had developed a reputation for unflappable calm. But in this moment, he felt anything but calm. A surge of parental protectiveness collided with executive authority, creating an explosive cocktail of emotion. Mr. Johnson, your thoughts on the proposed cutbacks? Winston looked up, finding the entire board staring at him expectantly. He cleared his throat. I apologize, but we need to take a brief recess. Family emergency, 15 minutes. Without waiting for a response, he strode from the room, already dialing Marcus's number. The call connected on the second ring. Dad. Marcus's voice sounded small, younger than his 17 years. Marcus, what's happening? Are you still at O'Hare? Yeah, they just escorted me off the plane with security. It was humiliating, Dad. Everyone was staring. This woman in my row told the flight attendant I was suspicious because I was writing in my notebook and looking at the Stanford campus maps. Winston paced the empty hallway, each word from his son like a physical blow. He had spent decades building an airline where this exact scenario wasn't supposed to happen, where procedures were designed to prevent profiling, where staff were trained in cultural awareness, where decisions were based on observable behaviors rather than subjective fears. Did they check your ID? Look at your materials. They checked my ID, but no one even asked to see my notebook or the Stanford information. They just took her word for it. The captain never even came out of the cockpit, just sent word that I had to leave. Winston felt a cold fury building in his chest, but kept his voice calm. Are you alone now? Yeah, they left me at the customer service desk. The flight's about to take off without me. They said they'd rebook me, but Dad, everyone on that plane thinks I'm some kind of threat. The resignation in his son's voice cut deeper than anger would have. Winston had heard that tone before from colleagues passed over for promotion from flight attendants recounting passenger interactions from Diane during her darkest moments of illness when she'd said, "Some battles you just can't win." It was acceptance of an unjust reality, and hearing it from his 17-year-old son was unbearable. Stay exactly where you are, Winston said, his mind already formulating a plan. I'm making some calls. I'll call you right back. Ending the call, Winston immediately dialed Alan Pierce, TransAim's Chief Operations Officer. When Alan answered, Winston didn't bother with pleasantries. Alan, I need Flight 2267 to San Francisco, held at the gate immediately. Held, Winston, it's already completed pushback. What's going on? My son Marcus was just removed from that flight for suspicious behavior. Suspicious behavior that consisted of working on his engineering homework and reviewing Stanford University materials. A beat of silence followed. Jesus, Winston. I didn't know Marcus was on that flight. Let me make some calls. We'll get him back on board. That's not enough, Alan. I want to know how this happened. Who made this decision, based on what evidence? And I want the passengers who reported him identified. The rage Winston had carefully controlled while speaking to Marcus now bled into his voice. This wasn't just about his son anymore. It was about every policy he'd implemented, every diversity initiative he'd championed, every promise he'd made to Diane about the kind of company they were building together. If Transamerican could fail his son this spectacularly, how many other passengers had received similar treatment without the recourse of a direct line to the chairman, I understand. Let me handle this. I'll call you back in 5. Winston paced the empty conference room, his mind racing through every possible scenario. Marcus had been profiled. There was no other explanation. A bright, well-dressed teenager working on advanced mathematics had been deemed suspicious because of the color of his skin. On his airline, the airline his wife had helped build into a family. He stopped at the wall of photographs that chronicled TransAim history. There in the center was an image from 10 years ago. Winston and Diane, at the unveiling of the company's Skies for All initiative, a comprehensive program designed to make air travel more accessible and equitable. Diane's hand was on his arm, her smile radiant with pride and purpose. His phone rang Alan again. "Winston, I've spoken with the gate. The aircraft has already departed. They're number 3 for takeoff." Winston's voice turned glacial. Then, "Have the tower recall them. Winston, be reasonable. We can put Marcus on the next flight to San Francisco first class." "I'll personally," Alan, listen carefully. "Either that aircraft returns to the gate, or I swear to God I will ground every trans-American plane currently in the air." The threat hung in the silence between them. It was unprecedented, possibly illegal, and would cost millions. But in this moment, Winston didn't care. A long pause followed. "You can't be serious? Try me. My son was just publicly humiliated and treated like a criminal on one of our aircraft. This isn't just about Marcus. This is about what TransAim stands for." Diane would have his voice caught. Diane would have burned the place to the ground. Another pause. "Let me see what I can do." While waiting for Alan's call back, Winston dialed Marcus again. "Has the plane left?" he asked, without preamble. "Yeah, about 5 minutes ago." Marcus replied, his voice steadier now. "Dad, you don't need to make a big deal about this. I can just take another flight." Winston closed his eyes, recognizing Diane's pragmatism in his son's words. She had been the one to teach Marcus to choose his battles, to weigh the emotional cost of confrontation against the likelihood of meaningful change. But sometimes she had also been the one to say, "If not now, when, if not us who? Marcus, listen to me. This is absolutely a big deal. What happened to you was wrong on every level. I need you to go back to the gate and wait there. Can you do that for me? Okay? What's going on? Just trust me. I'm fixing this." Winston ended the call as Alan's number flashed on his screen again. "The tower says they can't recall the aircraft. Without a security reason," Alan reported. "The captain is refusing to return, saying it would further disrupt the passengers." Captain Roberts Winston knew him, a 26-year veteran with an impeccable safety record and a reputation for running a tight ship. The same captain who had once questioned the need for unconscious bias training during its implementation 3 years ago. "I don't see colour in my cockpit," he'd said. "I just see competence." Winston had let it slide, then prioritizing harmony over accountability. Now he wondered how many other small compromises, overlooked comments, and unchallenged assumptions had accumulated to create a culture where his son could be removed from an aircraft without due process. Winston's patience evaporated. "Then we have a problem, Alan, because I wasn't making an idle threat. I want every trans-American aircraft grounded now." "Winston, that's insane. We're talking about hundreds of flights, thousands of passengers. I'm well aware of the numbers. Either we stand for something as a company, or we don't. Call the Emergency Operations Center. Initiate Protocol Alpha." Protocol Alpha was TransAim's nuclear option, a complete system-wide grounding only to be used in cases of imminent threat or catastrophic safety concern. It had been deployed only twice in the company's history, once after 911 and once during a major computer system failure 3 years ago. "The board will have your head for this," Alan warned. "Let them try. Make the call." Alan Winston hung up and immediately called TransAim's General Counsel, Sandra Patel. "Sandra, I've just initiated Protocol Alpha." A sharp intake of breath. A full grounding. "What's happened?" Winston quickly explained the situation with Marcus. As he spoke, he could hear Sandra's keyboard clicking. No doubt she was already documenting the conversation, weighing liability considerations, and preparing for the inevitable shareholder questions. "I need you to prepare for the fallout. The board, the shareholders, the press, all of it. Winston, while I sympathize with the situation, this response is extreme." "Is it? Tell me, Sandra, what message does it send when the chairman's own son can be removed from our aircraft based on nothing but the paranoid suspicion of another passenger? What does that say about how we treat our regular customers? Our flight attendants didn't even examine his materials before escorting him off with security." Sandra's tone softened. "I understand your anger. I've known Marcus since he was in elementary school, but there are other ways to address this. Not with the same impact, Winston replied firmly. Sometimes you need to cauterize a wound. This is one of those times. He thought of Diane again, of her insistence that systems only changed when the cost of maintaining the status quo became greater than the cost of transformation. Make it expensive to be wrong, she'd advised during particularly difficult corporate battles. As he ended the call with Sandra, Winston's executive assistant, burst into the room, her face pale. Sir, the Emergency Operations Center is calling. They're asking for confirmation of Protocol Alpha. They say all flights are being instructed to land at the nearest suitable airport. Winston nodded grimly. Tell them the order stands and inform the board our recess is extended indefinitely. We've got a new crisis to manage. As Marcus sat dejectedly at gate C-42, watching airport staff scramble with increasing urgency, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize. Hello, Mr. Johnson. This is Jessica Miller, the flight attendant from your flight earlier. Her voice sounded strained, anxious. Are you still in the terminal? Yes, at the gate, Marcus replied, confused. Why, sir, I've been instructed to find you immediately. Your flight is being recalled to the gate. Marcus sat up straighter. What? Why, I'm not at liberty to say, sir, but it's imperative that you wait there. The aircraft is returning now. The sudden difference in her tone, the shift from suspicion to solicitude, told Marcus something significant had changed. His father had clearly pulled some strings, though the extent of Winston's intervention remained unclear. Before Marcus could ask any more questions, the gate agent's phone rang. The agent answered, listened briefly, then looked directly at Marcus with wide eyes. Yes, sir. He's right here, sir. The agent held out the phone. It's for you. It's the CEO. Marcus took the phone, bewildered. Hello, Marcus. It's Alan Pierce, your father's COO. Are you all right? Yes, sir. Confused, but okay. Good. Stay exactly where you are. Flight 2267 is returning to the gate. You'll be rewarded with a full apology from the captain. I'm on my way to O'Hare now. Personally, Marcus had met Alan Pierce several times at company events. A brisk, efficient man with a reputation for solving problems before they reached Winston's desk. His direct involvement signaled the seriousness of the situation. Mr. Pierce, what's happening? Why is the flight coming back? A hesitation. Your father has made his displeasure known in a rather dramatic fashion. Dramatic how Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. His father rarely lost his temper, but when he did, the consequences were invariably seismic. That's not important right now. Alan deflected. Just know that this situation is being addressed at the highest levels. As the call ended, Marcus noticed a commotion at the neighboring gates. Gate agents were on phones. Passengers were gathering in confused clusters, and the departure boards were suddenly showing Diayed beside every Trans-American flight. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking. Trans-American Airlines initiate system-wide grounding. All flights affected. Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. His father had grounded the entire airline because of what happened to him. The magnitude of Winston's response sent a complex wave of emotions through Marcus. Gratitude that his father had taken the situation so seriously, embarrassment at becoming the center of a corporate crisis, and a growing anxiety about the fallout. How many travel plans were being disrupted, how much money was being lost, all because of a misunderstanding in row 17. Before he could process this, a voice came over the terminal announcement system. Attention in the terminal. Trans-American Flight 2267 is returning to Gate C-42. All Trans-American flights are currently delayed. We appreciate your patience as we work to resolve this operational issue. Through the large windows, Marcus could see Flight 2267 taxiing back toward the terminal. As it approached, another text from his father arrived. Winston, stay at the gate. Alan Pierce is coming. This ends today. Marcus, Dad, did you ground the entire airline because of what happened to me? Winston, some things are non-negotiable. This is one of them. The simplicity of his father's response surprised Marcus. Winston Johnson was known for nuanced measured reactions, not grand gestures. But perhaps his father's response wasn't as out of character as it initially seemed. After all, hadn't Diane once told him that Winston had threatened to resign from his previous airline when they refused to promote a qualified black pilot to captain? Hadn't he pulled TransAim's advertising from a major network after a commentator made racist remarks about a company spokesperson? Maybe this was simply the most visible manifestation of principles Winston had always held, but usually enforced through quieter channels. As the reality of the situation sank in, Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions: embarrassment, vindication, and a dawning sense of the power his father wielded. He wasn't sure whether to be grateful or mortified. Dorothy Whitman approached him, having deplaned ahead of the other passengers. "Marcus, what in the world is happening? They turned us around mid-taxi and said it was a chairman's directive. Then I saw the news alert about all trans-American flights being grounded." Marcus swallowed hard. "My father is Winston Johnson." Dorothy's eyes widened in recognition. "The chairman of Trans-American. Oh my." She sat beside him processing this information. "So when they removed you from the flight, they had no idea who I was," Marcus confirmed. "And I didn't tell them. I just wanted to go to my college visit like a normal kid." Dorothy patted his hand. "Well, there's nothing normal about this situation now, dear." As passengers began streaming off Flight 2267, the atmosphere was tense. Many were on phones, likely learning about the system-wide grounding. Some looked annoyed, others confused. Sharon and Richard Miller emerged, Sharon's face pinched with irritation, until she spotted Marcus at the gate. Her eyes widened in shock. Behind them came Captain Roberts and the flight crew, including Jessica and Michael. The captain, a veteran pilot with salt and pepper hair and the authoritative bearing that came with 30 years in the cockpit, scanned the gate area until he located Marcus. "Mr. Johnson," he called, approaching with purpose. "I'm Captain Roberts. I owe you an apology." The gate area fell silent as passengers recognized Marcus as the young man who had been removed earlier. Sharon Miller froze, her expression shifting from irritation to alarm. "I made a decision based on incomplete information." The captain continued, his voice carrying in the hushed gate area. "It was an error in judgment that caused you considerable distress, and for that, I am truly sorry." Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond. This public apology was simultaneously validating and excruciating. Furthermore, Captain Roberts continued, "I've been informed that all trans-American flights have been grounded pending a review of our passenger treatment policies. While this will unfortunately impact many travelers today, it speaks to how seriously the company takes this incident." Murmurs spread through the gathered crowd as the implications became clear. A young black man had been removed from a flight on suspicion alone, and now the entire airline was grounded in response. Sharon Miller's face had drained of color. Her husband looked equally stricken. As realization dawned on those around them that she had been the one to report Marcus, passengers began to stare and whisper. The gate agent's phone rang again. After a brief conversation, she approached Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Pierce has arrived. He's asked to speak with you in the Trans-American Lounge, Captain Roberts, and the Millers are requested to join as well." As Marcus stood to follow the gate agent, Dorothy Whitman caught his arm. "You hold your head high, young man. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." With a grateful nod to Dorothy, Marcus walked through the terminal, aware of the stares following him. The captain and flight attendants followed several paces behind, with the Millers reluctantly bringing up the rear. In the exclusive Trans-American Chairman's Lounge, Alan Pierce waited immaculate in a charcoal suit. Despite having clearly rushed to the airport, he greeted Marcus with a warm handshake. "Marcus, I wish we were meeting again under better circumstances. Your father speaks of you often." Marcus had met Pierce at company events over the years, holiday parties, the occasional dinner, but this was their first one-on-one interaction. The COO's reputation for efficiency and decisiveness was well earned. His presence at O'Hare underscored the gravity of the situation. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Pierce," Marcus replied, maintaining the poise that had been ingrained in him since childhood. Alan's expression turned serious as he addressed the gathered group. Let me be clear about what's happening. Chairman Johnson has instituted a complete system-wide grounding of all trans-American aircraft. Over 300 flights are currently affected, with that number growing by the minute. Captain Roberts palled. Sharon Miller gasped audibly. This is an unprecedented action outside of a national security emergency. Alan continued. It will cost the airline millions of dollars and generate significant negative publicity. But Chairman Johnson feels it necessary to underscore a fundamental point. Trans-American does not discriminate against its passengers, and we do not remove people from aircraft based on unfounded suspicions. The gravity of Winston's decision hung in the air. 300 flights, thousands of passengers, millions of dollars, all to make an unequivocal statement about one 17-year-old's treatment. Alan turned to the Millers. Mrs. Miller, you reported Marcus as suspicious because he was writing in a notebook and looking at university campus materials. Is that correct? Sharon squirmed uncomfortably. He was writing strange symbols and muttering to himself. In today's climate, you can't be too careful. The strange symbols were advanced calculus for a robotics project, Marcus said quietly. The suspicious materials were information about Stanford University's engineering program. Sharon glanced at him, then quickly away, unable to meet his eyes. Richard Miller placed a supportive hand on his wife's shoulder, though his expression suggested he was struggling with embarrassment. And what exactly made you suspicious, Mrs. Miller? Alan pressed. What specifically triggered your concern? Unable to articulate a non-discriminatory reason, Sharon fell silent. Her husband stepped forward. We made a mistake. Obviously, we're very sorry for the confusion and any embarrassment we caused. Alan nodded crisply. Your apology is noted. Now here's what happens next. Flight 2267 will proceed to San Francisco once this meeting concludes. Marcus will be on it upgraded to first class. Captain Roberts, you and your crew will continue to operate this flight, but there will be a formal review of the decisions made today. Captain Roberts nodded solemnly. Understood, sir. I take full responsibility. As you should, Alan agreed. And, Mrs. Miller, you're welcome to continue on this flight as well. However, I want to be perfectly clear. If you or any passenger has legitimate safety concerns, our crews are trained to evaluate them properly. What happened today, jumping to conclusions, failing to properly investigate, and publicly humiliating a passenger, will not be tolerated on TransAim flights. Is that understood? Sharon nodded, thoroughly chastened. Now Alan continued. Chairman Johnson is on his way to the airport. He'll be making a public statement about today's events and the company's response. Once that's complete, we'll begin resuming operations across the system. As the meeting concluded, Marcus pulled Alan aside. Mr. Pierce is my dad really coming here? He doesn't need to do that. Alan's expression softened. Marcus, there's something you should understand about your father. In 20 years working with him, I've never seen him compromise on two things, safety and family. Today touches on both. Trust me, wild horses couldn't keep him away. 90 minutes later, Winston Johnson stood at a hastily arranged podium in the main terminal of O'Hare Airport. Behind him stood Marcus Allen Pierce and Sandra Patel. News cameras from every major network captured the scene. Winston looked every inch the corporate leader, his bespoke suit impeccable, his posture commanding, his expression grave. But those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the barely perceptible tremor in his hands as he adjusted the microphone. Today, Trans-American Airlines failed one of our passengers. Winston began, his deep voice carrying authority and genuine regret. We failed to treat him with the respect and dignity that every customer deserves. We jumped to conclusions based on appearance rather than facts. We embraced suspicion over reason. He paused, surveying the assembled press. That this passenger happens to be my son, Marcus Johnson, is both relevant and irrelevant. Relevant because it brought this incident to my immediate attention. Irrelevant because this should not happen to any passenger regardless of who they are or who they know. The cameras flashed as Winston gestured to the departure boards where hundreds of flights now showed as delayed or cancelled. The decision to ground our entire fleet was not made lightly, but some principles cannot be compromised. Some lessons must be learned definitively. Behind the podium, Marcus watched his father with a mixture of pride and amazement. Winston Johnson had built a reputation as a pragmatic businessman willing to make difficult decisions for the financial health of the company. But today, he was revealing another side. The fierce protector, the principled leader willing to pay a significant price to correct an injustice. Winston outlined a series of immediate changes. Mandatory antibius training for all customer F-facing staff. A revised protocol for passenger concerns requiring factual evaluation before action, and a new corporate ombudsman position to investigate complaints of discriminatory treatment. Transamerican was founded with the belief that the skies belong to everyone. Winston continued, "My late wife Diane, who many of you knew as our former VP of Customer Experience, instilled in this company a commitment to treating each passenger as we would want our own families treated. Today, we failed to live up to that standard." The mention of Diane brought a lump to Marcus's throat. His mother had indeed been passionate about the customer experience, particularly for those who might face additional challenges while traveling. She had pioneered programs for passengers with disabilities, established multilingual support services, and advocated tirelessly for more diverse hiring practices. A reporter called out, "Mr. Johnson, critics are already saying this response is extreme and financially irresponsible to shareholders. How do you respond?" Winston's gaze was steady. "I respond by asking what message it would send if I did nothing. If I allowed my son to be treated this way and simply accepted an apology behind closed doors, what would that say to every other passenger who has experienced similar treatment but lacks the connections to be heard? Some costs cannot be measured in dollars." Another reporter followed up. "Is this really about all passengers or just about your son?" "It's about the standards we claim to uphold," Winston replied without hesitation. "My son's experience simply illuminated a gap between our stated values and our actual practices. If TransAim fails in this way, we deserve the consequences, all of us, from the boardroom to the cockpit." The questions continued for another 15 minutes, with Winston fielding each one with the measured control that had defined his career. As the press conference concluded, Winston put his arm around Marcus's shoulders, a rare public display of affection from the normally reserved executive. "I'm proud of how you handled yourself today," he said, the microphones catching his words. "Your mother would be too." In that moment, Marcus understood something fundamental about his father that he'd never fully grasped before. Winston Johnson wasn't just a successful executive who happened to be black. He was a black man who used his success to ensure others wouldn't face the barriers he had overcome. The airline wasn't just his career, it was his platform for creating the change he wanted to see. As they walked away from the podium, Sandra Patel fell into step beside them. "The board is demanding an emergency session," she murmured. "They're not happy. Schedule it for tomorrow morning," Winston replied calmly. "I'm taking my son to dinner, then putting him on a flight to San Francisco. The board can wait." Sandra nodded, impressed, but not surprised by his priorities. "I'll start preparing the legal justification for today's actions. We're on solid ground with the safety protocols aspect, but the shareholders will question the financial impact. Let them," Winston said. "Some things are worth fighting for." 3 hours later, Marcus finally boarded a rescheduled flight to San Francisco, this time in first class. Despite his protests, the other passengers, many delayed for hours by the system-wide grounding, recognized him from the news coverage that had dominated the afternoon. Some offered sympathetic smiles or words of support. A few seemed annoyed, blaming him for their inconvenience, but most simply watched with curiosity as the teenager whose experience had brought a major airline to a standstill found his seat. The first-class cabin felt like a world away from the economy section where he'd started his day. The wide leather seat, the attentive service, the respectful distance maintained by fellow passengers, all reminded Marcus of the insulation privilege could provide. He thought of his father's suggestion that morning that he fly business class, recognizing now that it hadn't been about comfort, but protection. Dorothy Wittmann, also rebooked on this flight, stopped by his first-class seat before continuing to economy. "Your father did a brave thing today," she said quietly. "Sometimes justice requires disruption." As the flight took off, Marcus thought about her words. His phone buzzed with a final text from his father. "Winston, safe travels. Call when you land. And Marcus, I want you to know something. What happened today wasn't just about you. It was about the kind of world your mother and I always wanted to build for you. A world where you're judged by your character, not your appearance. We're not there yet. But maybe today we moved a little closer." The message brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Throughout his childhood, his parents had carefully balanced preparation for the world's harsh realities with determination to change those realities. They had taught him both how to navigate unjust systems and how to challenge them when possible. Winston rarely spoke so directly about his hopes and fears. The text revealed the emotional undercurrent beneath his decisive actions today. Not just anger at his son's mistreatment, but a deeper anguish about the world Marcus had to navigate, and a fierce commitment to using his position to improve it. If you're enjoying stories like this one, please consider subscribing to our channel and letting us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. As darkness fell over the Midwest, Marcus Johnson opened his Stanford materials once more, allowing himself to dream again of the future. Behind him, hundreds of trans-American planes gradually returned to the skies, each carrying the weight of a promise. That dignity was not a luxury, but a right that belonged to everyone who traveled the open sky. By the time Marcus landed in San Francisco, the story had gone viral. Trans-American grounding was trending nationwide. Opinion pieces debated whether Winston Johnson's response had been admirably principled or wildly disproportionate. Civil rights organizations praised the decisive action, while financial analysts criticized the cost to shareholders. The story had tapped into broader conversations about race privilege and corporate responsibility. Some commentators lauded Winston for using his position to force systemic change. Others questioned whether such dramatic action would have been taken for anyone else, or suggested the response was primarily about protecting the Johnson family's reputation. As Marcus navigated SFO Airport, he found himself approached by strangers who recognized him from the news. "You Winston Johnson's boy?" asked an elderly black man as Marcus waited for his luggage. "What your daddy did today? That's old school. That's how change happens. You remember that?" Marcus nodded respectfully, slightly overwhelmed by the attention. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications, texts from friends and family, social media alerts, news updates. Devon had sent 17 consecutive messages, the last one reading, "Dude, your dad shut," and an entire airline for you. Legend status. The Stanford admissions representative who met him at baggage claim seemed equally star-struck. "We've been following the news, Marcus. What an extraordinary experience you've had getting here." "Not exactly how I planned my college visit to start," Marcus admitted with a rueful smile. "Well, the engineering department is particularly eager to meet you now. Your father's stand has resonated with a lot of our faculty." Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions at this revelation. Had today's events just made him even more of a Johnson rather than simply Marcus? Would his Stanford application now be evaluated through the lens of his father's actions rather than his own merits? As they drove toward campus, Marcus watched the California landscape unfold outside the window, so different from Chicago's urban grid. Palm trees, rolling hills, the distant shimmer of the bay. It was like entering another world. "Your mother was an alumni, correct?" the representative asked. "Yes, class of '94. Engineering like I'm hoping to study." "She would be proud of how you handled today." Not many teenagers would maintain such composure. Marcus thought about this. "I'm not sure I had much choice. When you're black in America, keeping your composure isn't optional, it's survival." The representative, a middle-aged white woman, looked momentarily uncomfortable, then nodded. "I imagine that's true. It shouldn't be, but it is. My mom used to say that composure is a skill, not a burden. Not a..." Marcus continued warming to the subject. She said it gives you time to choose your response, instead of just reacting. Sounds like a wise woman, the representative replied. The wisest, Marcus agreed. She would have handled today differently than my dad, though more strategically, less dramatically. And how would you have handled it if you had your father's position? The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd been so focused on responding to the situation as it unfolded that he hadn't considered what he might have done with actual power. I'm not sure, he said finally. Part of me thinks my dad's response was excessive, but another part understands why he did it. Sometimes you need to make a statement that can't be ignored. Back in Chicago, Winston Johnson faced the TransAim board in an emergency session. The boardroom crackled with tension as directors representing major shareholders demanded explanations. The stock has dropped 6% in after-hours trading, noted Barbara Winters, the longest-serving board member. The financial press is calling this an emotional overreaction. The operational costs alone are estimated at $12 million, not counting the reputational damage. Barbara had known Winston for over 20 years, had supported his rise to the chairmanship, had been a friend to Diane. But today, her fiduciary responsibility to shareholders placed her in opposition to his actions. Winston remained unruffled. And yet, I've received calls from the CEOs of 3 major corporations this evening, all commending our decisive action and expressing interest in exclusive corporate contracts. Turns out, companies value partners who demonstrate clear ethical boundaries. That's all well and good, interjected Richard Townsend, representing the largest institutional investor. But this was a family matter that you turned into a corporate crisis. You used company resources to address a personal grievance. Townsend had opposed Winston's appointment as chairman 5 years earlier, arguing that his progressive agenda would prioritize social initiatives over profitability. Today's events had seemingly confirmed his worst fears. Winston's expression hardened. Let me be absolutely clear. If the passenger in question had been anyone other than my son, and I learned about the incident, my response would have been identical. The fact that it was Marcus simply meant I learned about it immediately rather than through channels. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a measured intensity. What happened today exposed a critical flaw in our culture, and procedures one that could have resulted in significant legal liability had the passenger been unrelated to TransAim. We are fortunate it was Marcus. It gave us the opportunity to address the issue decisively publicly and on our own terms. Sandra Patel, the General Counsel, nodded in agreement. From a legal perspective, Winston's action, while dramatic, significantly reduced our exposure to discrimination lawsuits. By acknowledging the issue so forcefully, we've positioned ourselves as taking proactive steps to address bias. The debate continued for hours, with the board ultimately voting to support Winston's actions by a narrow margin. Alan Pierce's detailed presentation on the potential long-term benefits, improved corporate culture, enhanced reputation with key demographic groups, and the marketing value of being seen as a principled organization had swayed enough directors to give Winston the victory he needed. As the meeting concluded well past midnight, Barbara Winters approached Winston privately. That was a close vote, Winston. You took a huge risk today. Some things are worth risking everything for, Barbara. She studied him thoughtfully. Diane would have done exactly the same thing, you know. Winston smiled slightly. That's the highest compliment you could give me. She was always the moral compass of this company, and it seems she passed that compass to both you and Marcus. Barbara gathered her belongings. I voted with you today because I've been in this industry for 40 years, and I've seen too many companies choose expedience over ethics. It always costs more in the end. As Barbara left, Winston remained in the empty boardroom, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day's crisis was ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the beginnings of doubt. Had he overreacted? Had he risked too much the company's stability, employee jobs, his own position to make a point? What would Diane have really done? His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, arrived safely at Stanford. It's beautiful here. Thank you for everything today. The simple message dispelled Winston's doubts. Whatever the consequences of today's actions, his son was safe, his dignity intact. Some prices were worth paying. In the days that followed, the Trans-American grounding became a case study in corporate ethics and crisis management. Business schools analyzed Winston's decision. News programs debated the proper response to bias incidents. Civil rights organizations pointed to the incident as an example of how systems can change when leaders take principled stands. The story evolved in unexpected ways. Sharon Miller, initially portrayed as the villain in early coverage, gave a tearful interview acknowledging her unconscious bias and pledging to undergo sensitivity training. Captain Roberts appeared at a Trans-American press conference, announcing new procedures, standing alongside Winston as the changes were detailed. Most surprisingly, Richard Miller, the quiet husband who had seemed a minor character in the drama, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal discussing his own complicity in the incident. "I knew my wife's concerns were unfounded," he wrote, but remained silent to avoid conflict. "My silence made me equally culpable." For Marcus, the Stanford visit proceeded surprisingly normally after the initial attention. He toured the engineering facilities, met with faculty, and fell in love with the campus just as his mother had decades earlier. He found himself drawn to the university's robotics lab, where researchers were developing assistive technologies similar to his own interests. During a meeting with the Dean of Engineering, Marcus was surprised when she brought up the incident directly. "Your father's response was extraordinary," she said. "But I'm more impressed by how you handled yourself throughout the situation. That composure and dignity speaks to your character." "Thank you," Marcus replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just ready to move past it and focus on my education. Of course, but I hope you'll consider sharing your perspective with our students at some point." The intersection of technology ethics and social justice is increasingly central to engineering education. By the time he flew home on a different airline, at his insistence, the media frenzy had begun to subside. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world and his place in it. When Marcus arrived at the penthouse, he found Winston in his home office reviewing documents. His father looked tired, the cost of the past few days evident in the new lines around his eyes. Yet he looked up with genuine pleasure when Marcus entered, a rare smile breaking through his professional facade. "Welcome home. How was Stanford amazing? Everything Mom said it would be." I think it's where I'm supposed to be." Winston nodded, satisfied. She always knew. Marcus sat down his bags and took a seat across from his father's desk. "Dad, I've been thinking about everything that happened, about what you did, and I'm still not sure how I feel about it. Part of me is grateful, part of me is embarrassed, and part of me wonders if it might have been too much." Winston considered this thoughtfully. "When I was your age, my father, your grandfather, worked as a janitor at Midway Airport. He cleaned the terminals where white businessmen walked without noticing him. One day, he overheard an airline executive complaining about how those people shouldn't be allowed to fly on the same planes as everyone else. Marcus listened intently. His father rarely spoke about his childhood. Your grandfather came home that night and told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Son, there are moments in life when you have the power to act and moments when you don't. Never waste the ones where you do.' Winston's gaze was steady. When I got your text, I had the power to act. So I did. But grounding an entire airline. Send a message that needed sending, not just to our employees or our passengers, but to every company watching. That some principles are non-negotiable." Marcus nodded slowly. "Mom would have done the same thing, wouldn't she?" Winston laughed. "Are you kidding? Your mother would have fired the entire flight crew on the spot, then personally flown the plane to San Francisco." They shared a moment of laughter, remembering Diane's legendary decisiveness. "I miss her," Marcus said quietly. Everyday Winston agreed. "But I see her in you constantly, especially in how you handled yourself through all of this. You showed remarkable grace under pressure." "I had good teachers." Winston stood moving around the desk to sit beside his son. "Marcus, the world you're growing up in isn't the one I hoped it would be by now. Your mother and I always believed things would be better easier for your generation. In some ways they are, but in others, we still have a long way to go. Marcus finished. Yes, but what happened this week? The conversations it started, maybe that's how change happens. Not all at once, but in moments of disruption that force people to reconsider what they've accepted as normal. Like grounding an airline because your son was profiled. Winston smiled. Exactly like that. Marcus considered whether to share the question that had been lingering in his mind since San Francisco. Dad, do you think what happened, your response to it, will affect how people see me? At Stanford, will they see me as Winston Johnson's son first and Marcus second? Winston's expression turned serious. People will always have their perceptions, Marcus. Some will see you primarily as my son, others as a young black man, others as an engineering student. You can't control those initial lenses. All you can control is what you do, the substance you bring, the contribution you make. Mom used to say something similar. She was smarter than me, Winston said with a sad smile. Always was. As evening fell over, Chicago father and son moved to the penthouse balcony, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere in the distance, trans-American planes were taking off and landing, each carrying passengers who had heard the story of what happened when the chairman's son was removed from a flight. But more importantly, each carrying crew members who had undergone new training, following new protocols, guided by new principles that recognized the dignity of every passenger, regardless of who they were, what they looked like, or who they knew. Dad Marcus said, as they watched the distant blinking lights of aircraft against the night sky. I've decided what I want to focus on at Stanford. Though artificial intelligence ethics using technology to reduce human bias, not amplify it. Marcus turned to his father. Maybe that's my way of continuing what you and Mom started. Making systems better, fairer. Winston put his arm around his son's shoulders, pride swelling in his chest. I think that sounds exactly right. He thought about Diane, who had always insisted that technology should serve humanity's highest aspirations, not its basest instincts. She would have been thrilled by Marcus's choice, seeing in it the perfect synthesis of his technical abilities and moral compass. You know, Winston said thoughtfully, your mother always said that the most important innovations aren't the ones that make things faster or more efficient, but the ones that make us more human, more connected, more just. Marcus nodded. That's what I want to build. Systems that see people fully, not partially. As they stood together on the balcony, Winston thought about cycles breaking and new ones beginning. About a teenager removed from a plane who might someday build systems that would prevent such incidents. About his wife, who would have been so proud of the man their son was becoming. And about power, the kind that came with titles and positions, but also the kind that came from knowing when to use it, when to risk everything for what mattered most. Some lessons couldn't be taught. They had to be demonstrated. Today, Marcus had learned perhaps the most important one, that in a world that didn't always see his full humanity, he came from a legacy of people who would ground planes to assert it. In that, there was both burden and blessing, challenge and hope, a history and a future, connected by a father and son, watching aircraft navigate the night sky. Each light a reminder of promises kept and promises still to make.